Order, order. Welcome to this meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. Today is the 7th oral evidence session of our BBC Royal Charter Review Inquiry, and this is the day we get to quiz the BBC themselves. And we are joined for the first time by Matt Britton, the Director General of the BBC, and not the first time, a frequent guest of the Select Committee, Dr. Samir Shah, CBE, who is the Chair of the BBC. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Matt, I want to start the questions with you, please. You listed your three priorities in your staff email, and you talked about editorial excellence, you talked about being clear on your priorities, and you talked about making the strongest possible argument for our future. What is your argument for the BBC?
Well, thank you. I'm just 6.5 weeks in, so I've been doing a lot of listening and learning, but also before joining I had the chance to tour the country and see what the BBC was doing in the front line, from local radio to drama productions, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales. And I think the creative engine and powerhouse for the UK is a key part of the case for the BBC. Its reach for audiences. If you think about it, it's quite remarkable when we've got infinite choice in our pockets that the BBC still reaches 94% of UK adults every week. It's pretty remarkable. It's pretty remarkable that it's the most trusted, despite some of the recent issues, the most trusted news provider domestically and internationally. So I see those as huge strengths. But I also see, we're in a week where ITV and Sky are merging. We've seen Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount merging. The shift in consumer behaviour around media and the concentration in power that you heard from other witnesses about, the concentration of power in some of the American and Chinese players means we're at a critical moment. And I see the jeopardy for the BBC, but I also see the strengths. Final point I'll make, because I'll be snappy as you suggest, but happy to expand on this. The reason I ultimately decided to join the BBC at this time, because I could have done other things, was because I believe in its mission. Genuinely, I read the 100-year history. The BBC has been at the forefront of innovation in technology, creativity and journalism for over a century. I believe it's needed now more than ever. In that world of a concentration of power, disruption by technology, British values and truth and British creativity, I think, are more important than ever. And we're just announcing today that the World Service has reached over, or BBC internationally has reached over 500 million people a week. So we have a huge role to play in the world looking for this kind of truth and creativity, as we do in the UK.
The fact is, though, that there's a growing number of people, particularly younger people, who just don't see why they should be paying for the BBC because they don't watch it, or they think that they don't watch it. What would your argument be to them?
You're absolutely right. So if 94% of adults every month are in touch with the BBC, that suggests that people use it more than they might realise, but only 80% of households are paying the licence fee. And, coming in fresh, what I see is the BBC is sort of locked into yesterday's model of consumption, so the licence fee being payable on linear television and iPlayer, when the world's moved on. Consumers are living in today's world, or tomorrow's world today, and so we need to look again at the mechanism for funding for the BBC. And as part of Charter, obviously, BBC's independence and future depends on having universal, sustainable and scale funding, and I think that's really important. So I think the BBC is still relevant to young people, but it hasn't been going where the audience is. And coming from a world of technology, I know that very well. There's progress being made. I'm delighted to see that BBC News is now the most subscribed news service on YouTube in the English language, over 20 million subscribers. So it's made some progress, but it needs to go further. But it's held back, I think, by that straitjacket of the current licence fee mechanic, and obviously that's no longer fit for purpose.
You've mentioned your background in big tech. You've got a great commercial pedigree. What do you think, how do you think that can bring to bear on that ability to be able to convince people that the BBC is a kind of modern, forward-thinking broadcaster for the future?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important. One of the key principles, I said on my first day, actually just before I walked through the door, my priorities personally were making the case for the BBC, editorial excellence and velocity, by which I mean sort of speed, but in a direction, so not in a circle. And that's about getting closer to the audience, being simpler as an organisation, and being faster to the future. So closer to the audience, absolutely. if you look at young audiences, they're 5 times as much media time on YouTube as they are on any linear television. And that's actually happening the older you get, almost up to kind of my age bracket. That shift is happening. I noticed Carolyn McCall on the announcement of the merger of the CEO of ITV saying, change is exponential. So I do think that's happening incredibly fast. So I think what I can bring is a sense of how to operate in an uncertain but fast-changing world at a greater speed. And that will require us to experiment more, probably to partner with other people, and to be focused on tomorrow's world. And I do think some of the arrangements under the Charter that will be reviewed, to do with requirements around the old ways of working, can hold an organisation like the BBC back. So part of what we've got to do is re-adopt that pioneering spirit of the original founders of the BBC around technology. I think it's unlikely that building our own technology in every respect is going to be something that's sustainable. But I do think, if I think about the case for the BBC Today, Chair, and I'll just be brief on this, the audience value is enormous, and we need to sustain that. There's a second case, which is the economic impact. I'd love to come on to that, which is big, and I can share some report we're publishing today. And I think the third case is sovereignty. It is a world where the BBC is the biggest funder of original British content today. People around the world want that content and want those values, but we're being disrupted by a small number of very big, very powerful tech players. I know about this because I came from that world, and I think that puts at risk our ability to create content, our ability to fight misinformation, and our ability to distribute that content to audiences.
Do you say to those who say, he's a big tech guy, he understands how you drive viewers, he understands how you get eyeballs, he understands deep-rooted commercial philosophy, but he doesn't understand the BBC's public service ethos?
I think it's a very fair question. Look, I think my job at the BBC is to provide leadership and to create the conditions for brilliant editorial, technical and creative people to do their best work. And that's, I think, why you should ask Samir, but why the board decided to appoint me. I'm not a novice when it comes to journalism and programmes, but I'm also not an expert. But I have had experience of leading large organisations through change, of building partnerships, and also thinking about responsibility. So I won't go into in much detail my time in technology, but I led the approach for Google partnering with large news publishers around the world to try to ensure that they could sustain their content in a digital environment, and Google became the biggest funder of journalism through its advertising program. So I've always cared about that. I care genuinely about public service. I'm British, I've always lived here. And I think the final thing I'd say is, some of you may experience this, people watching might as well. When you travel internationally and you're British, people often thank you for the BBC, even if you've got nothing to do with it. And I think that is one of the reasons I chose to join.
But the question still remains very slightly unanswered. You know that you're going to have to make some very difficult, tough financial choices, right? And you already have. You've already had to lay off jobs. When push comes to shove, and you have to make a decision between continuing to fund something that has a real public service value, but actually has dwindling viewer numbers, where does your decision fall?
You're absolutely right. So I came in with the need to save 10% of cost already announced, and I've been working with the team. When we made the first set of announcements, there will be more to come about how that restructuring happens. What I've asked the teams to do is have some key principles in mind when they're making those difficult choices, because we're no longer in the stage where we can say, well, we've got programmes nobody watches, or we've got functions that don't do everything. The BBC's made real progress, and the National Audit Office actually have credited the BBC for sort of getting overheads to a sensible benchmark level. So the principles I've asked our teams to look at are first and foremost to preserve and maximise audience value, to reduce duplication where there is duplication, and to simplify the BBC so it can move faster. And I think you can see in what the teams have already announced that it's hard. We're going to have to stop making some programmes that are very popular with people because there are more popular programmes. We're going to have to look again at how much we do in terms of the linear output. I mean, radio and television is traditionally known as the audiences are shifting faster and faster. The point I'd make is the BBC is not unique here. Sky and ITV have merged because they need scale. Warner Brothers Discovery and Paramount have merged before because they need scale. And on the production industry side, Banijay and All3Media have merged because they need scale. The BBC also needs to preserve its scale if it's to make the interventions that it needs in the market. And one of the just to pick one tidbit, I've been surprised and impressed by many things I've seen since arriving at the BBC. One being the impact of its work across the UK. 60% of its network spend is now outside London. 55% of staff are now outside London. Talk about something that only the BBC...
I'm going to move you on because we're going to move on to outside London in a minute, but I do want to move on.
I was just getting excited.
Yeah, I know. We'll get excited for Jeff because he's about to ask you the next question.
Thank you, Chair. And can I just put on record my role as the Chair of the All-Party Group on the BBC? We just want to explore funding issues a little more. Would the BBC support a licence fee that would have to be paid by all households that have the ability to receive and watch content, no matter what the platform or the device?
Shall I take that? It's obviously one of the most important questions that needs to be resolved in the Royal Charter. I just want to step back one moment before I answer that question. It's really important, and I think in the conversations and witnesses you've heard, this has come through very strongly, that the BBC is much more than just a broadcaster. It is a public good. It's a national asset. So our relationship to the licence fee payer or the funder is not simply a transactional one. It's not, as it were, we're not Netflix saying you pay $9.99, you get this programme. It's more than that. We provide a national asset, and we need to look at that funding model in those terms. As a result of that basic thought, it's really important that the funding model is both universal. Every household has a stake in the BBC. It makes the BBC a national asset. Secondly, it needs to provide enough scale, as Matt has so eloquently put, that the BBC is big enough not only to deliver its purpose, but to be able to compete in this new world that we're facing. And I think we've discussed, we can talk further about the kind of funding options we've are open to. It is, of course, for the government to decide. And it's one of the things, I was really interested to hear, as you were doing your witnesses, that the issue of the household levy surfaced again. And in our view, we are open to any conversation about the funding model. The household levy has many advantages. You know, it's enforceable. It takes out lots of the costs that the current licence fee thinks it can be fair. So we're open to that, but we do recognise that, first of all, in the Green Paper, the government had ruled it out. But, you know, we're open to that conversation. I think if it's not the household levy, the important point is universality and scale. And as Matt pointed out, the licence fee has always evolved to capture changes in behavioural consumption. The consumption behavioural change, we all know, is moving away from linear to on-demand platforms. So we need to capture that, and the modernised licence fee needs to capture that moment. And that will include other platforms. Currently, the licence fee, of course, if you watch ITV, you still have to pay the licence fee. If you're watching television, you still have. So it's that same principles, but the important thing here is a modernised licence fee must capture the way people are now consuming content, particularly the younger generation.
Were you disappointed that the government took both household levy and general taxation funding off the table as part of the consultation?
I don't think that it's not for us to be disappointed. I think we recognise the government's own views on these things. As I said before, I'll just repeat it. A household levy would solve a lot of problems for us, and we're certainly open to it. But we reckon that there's some political issues there, or the realities. It's kind of difficult to get through Parliament, requires new legislation. But it's really a matter for government.
You said that collection, just in your earlier contribution, I think you said collection and enforcement would be easier with a household levy. Do you think there would be additional barriers? Do you think it would be, from broadening it out that way, would it create any difficulties?
Yeah, so I've looked a little bit at this, and I think you see a number of European countries where they've moved to a household levy for the reasons that the chair mentioned around shifting behaviours. I think what the advantages are, as you say, is it's universal. Collection can be simple. In different places, it's done through utility bills. You could imagine broadband or mobile or electricity being ways to do this. So that gives you universality, which is one of the things we need, on behalf of our audiences. It can give you scale because it's universal and so on. I think it can reduce the collection costs, which are currently about £190 million a year for us to collect the licence fee. And I suppose it gives you an option, which is if you say that 80% of households are paying today and you went to 100% of households, the licence fee could be lowered for everyone, and government could make calls on lower income households, younger viewers, which I think is all quite appealing. As Samir says, I think the challenge is it's been ruled out, and I can understand the concerns about cost of living and so on households. But I think it's got merits, and others have found it to have merits. I think extending the scope of the existing mechanism has merits too. It's simpler, it probably wouldn't require legislation, but I think one of the challenges there would be the collection, which is already challenging and more challenging as more young people are used to just clicking and accessing content, and it becomes harder for us to enforce. The conversion rate on enforcement actions has been going down, as you know.
Can I just ask very quickly, Samir, Pat Young told us he thought the household levy was ruled out by the Treasury. Did you get that sense as well?
I don't know about the internal workings of the government. I think that the household levy could be seen and is effectively another tax, and I can imagine the Treasury has a view on that.
What about other ideas for funding that were also taken off the table? When the government said we're going to look, widely at different ways of funding this, and then immediately took half a dozen of the options off the table. What about the idea of a streamer levy, for example? How would you feel about that?
I think that's partly, if I may, I think that's partly the sort of extension of scope. So basically, as Samir said, a streamer levy is the equivalent of, if you watch ITV, you pay. Today's equivalent is if you watch Netflix, arguably YouTube, TikTok, any other streamer, you would pay. I think that's compelling in terms of extending it to reflect the reality of today's audiences. I think the challenge with it is how many of those people would pay, and how much would the cost of collection increase, and what would that do? The biggest challenge I think I see coming in is running an organisation to deliver what we're asked to in the Charter and what we might be asked to in future with unpredictable but declining income structurally is really challenging.
Yeah.
We need to attract and grow the best creative talent. I noticed you had James Graham here, who's brilliant. We spoke to him just last week with the board. Nobody else would have commissioned Sherwood. Nobody else would have, if you heard from Stephen Knight, nobody else would have commissioned Peaky Blinders. And so to attract and develop the kind of talent we need for the BBC to thrive requires a degree of sustainability. So universal, scale and sustainable within the context of a reset charter.
Whose role is it to communicate changes to the licence fee and what it covers and who should pay for it? Is that the government's role, or is that the role for you guys?
I'm sorry, just repeat the question. I didn't quite hear it.
So you have a case to make for why it's important that you get properly funded, and what changes to the licence fee are going to happen, and what's going to be covered and who should pay. But what I'm sensing from you is that you're very much saying, we've got our ideas, but actually this is going to be a governmental decision and we'll live with it. So I'm just a little bit confused as to whose job it is to then
It is the government's job.
public.
It is the government's job to determine all sorts of aspects of the licence fee. I mean, the level of the licence fee.
Yeah, but whose job is it? I understand that, but whose job is it to communicate that then to the public and to
I'm-
make the case for it?
Yes. We are, as you might imagine, heavily into discussions with DCMS, with their officials and our officials. We're having a series of meetings over the summer because, as you know, the government is preparing its white paper. We are trying to talk to them. I think we're having almost 16 meetings over the next 2 months, and we're going to be talking to them about all the issues we think we would like to communicate to the government, because they will prepare a document for the Secretary of State and the government, and we want to be part of that conversation.
Samir, that's a word salad. Just tell me, whose job is it, Matt?
Yeah,
whose job is it to communicate the changes to the public and persuade
As I understand
them?
it, 6.5 weeks in, I think this is correct. The licence fee unit that's operated for the BBC does the communication and collection. And I visited the main operations base in Darwin. I did a little mini internship for a few weeks before actually formally taking the role. So I went to see the licence fee unit. I sat and listened in on calls with people who were seeking to no longer continue payment and so on. So I think it's the case. It's the responsibility of the BBC through the licensing unit to communicate and collect.
So you're in a situation where the government will decide how it's going to, what's going to happen and how, and then it's your job to sell it.
As it currently stands, that's correct. And I think if you move to a household levy, which has been ruled out, then arguably the collection mechanic might be through a third party, such as a utility company. But as it stands today, and that's why I say that unit together, it's all activities, door knocking and mailing, which is a huge part of their activity. You have to physically send letters to people, which means we're exposed to the monopoly provision of letters, is about 190 million.
I completely interrupted you, Jeff.
That's absolutely fine, Chair, thank you. As you know, some people have the BBC funded by advertising or subscription. Matt, what would be the impact on the BBC of introducing advertising or subscription on domestic services?
I mean, I think First thing to say is I worked in a business that was funded for advertising for 20 years. Traditional advertising is in structural decline. The reason ITV and Sky have merged their network business is partly and largely driven by that. So you're fishing in a diminishing pool of advertising. And I was heartened to see the Sky ITV merger announcements about their commitment to UK content and regional news, which is something all of the PSBs, public service broadcasters, hold dear. So I think the impact of the BBC taking advertising would be to take it away from others, and I think that would be a devastating impact on the economy. I think the same to an extent with subscription. You know, there is a difference in the model, and that universality is a fundamental part of what's made the BBC successful today.
So that's, I suppose, more about the impact on the wider sector, which I think is fine. But what would be the impact on the BBC? What would be the impact on commissioning decisions if you had to have advertising?
Well, I think that
services?
Probably the best thing to do to understand that, rather than me hypothesise, is to look at what ITV does on commissioning. That is a commercial broadcaster. So if there were the funds available, the BBC would look more like ITV. I think some of the things that only the BBC does, I was stunned by this, by the way. 3.5 million children every week see Newsround from the BBC when school's in. 3.5 million. Bite size, 80% of secondary school pupils use bite size in their learning. So some of those services would be, I think, at risk if you were in a more advertising-funded model. If you look at local journalism, something that's dear to my heart, having worked in local press in the past, in the 20 years since I stopped working in local press, the top 3 local press players have gone from about 9,000 journalists to 3,000. So I think some of these things would be very, very hard to fund under a commercial funding model for the BBC, even if there were enough funding to go around across the public service media, which I don't believe there would be, because that's diminishing and shifting all the time.
Could I just add, the consequences of a subscription model would be what Matt has said, but even more so. We would be making programs to drive subscription, and therefore we would not be making programs that don't drive subscription. That's just logical. And there are loads of things that don't. Just look at the subscription models. Look at what Netflix does. We won't do children's programming. We won't do local programming. Our drama will become increasingly narrowly focused on things that drive subscription. Local storytelling, you know, all sorts of things. James Graham's program. Honestly, those wouldn't happen, and we would stop being a universal. We'd actually stop being the BBC that we know.
So that's interesting, because I think you both talked about the kind of practical impact, but there's a kind of principle decision. You both would argue that there are principles that drive the fact that the BBC shouldn't be funded by advertising.
I would totally agree with that. And again, coming fresh, many of the people at the BBC have said, try to keep that outsider mindset. And one of the things you see is people inside the BBC often mired in the things that could be better. When you see it from the outside, that strength in audience reach, that strength in, won 12 BAFTAs. It's the biggest funder of original content in the UK, across the UK. There are so many strengths that you would lose, I think, if you move to a commercial funding model, not least that it would be less funding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Let's move to Bio, please.
Yeah, morning, gentlemen. Matt, I'm going to come to you first. What more could the BBC commercial do if its borrowing limits were increased? And if those restrictions weren't there, what could you do?
So you're talking about what's now called BBC Studios, which is basically producing shows for the BBC and other people. It's distributing shows that are already made or rights deals with people internationally, and it's running a number of things like BritBox and other streaming platforms internationally. I think the opportunity to grow that is a significant one. I think we are in a bit of a cyclical moment. So when I talk to the team at Studios, and bear in mind I've just been 6.5 weeks, what they can say is that there was a period of time where the streamers globally were funding content hugely, because what they were trying to do is say, here's our show, come and sign up to our platform and stick with us. That game is over, and we've seen multi-billions spent on streamers that have yet to turn a profit, particularly American streamers. So that means the market is squeezed at a time when production costs are growing at around 7% year on year, partly driven by energy, but partly driven by, various other kind of cost of living factors. So there is scope to grow studios' revenues. More borrowing would allow us to be longer term in that, which could be useful. And it's something that I think we should be looking at within the scope of these discussions, because the more that the BBC can draw on commercial sources of funding, the more it can offset what's happened with the licence fee. And if I may, could just add a minute on this. Yeah. The committee probably understands this, but I think it was something that I needed to get clear on arrival. In the last 10 years, the BBC has lost 1.2, 1.3 billion of licence fee funding. About 60% of that is due to price freezes, which are government interventions, and taking on the over 75s and some of the World Service costs. So 60% of the drop in our income comes from policy, 40% from a reduction in households paying. What the BBC has done, Samir and Tim previously and the management team, has chosen to invest as much as possible in content and channels. It's kept as many services as possible running, spending cash reserves and dividends from the commercial business. The reason we've had to now make savings is because that game is over. We can grow studios and we'll continue to try to grow studios, but in a tougher market. All the factors that have led to the mergers I mentioned are the factors that we face as well, and that's one of the reasons why we're having to deal with making tough cuts and choices at the moment.
Okay, and just one final point. So you've explained quite eloquently around the challenges. How much of a priority is it for you to try and relook at, rethink, recalibrate the borrowing limits?
I think couldn't tell you that in the rank order of priorities, but coming in with a commercial background, I understand completely the public service remit, and we need to do everything we can to fund that as well as possible. I'm looking at all of the ways in which we could drive income for the BBC. Obviously, the charter settlement is the most significant part of that because licence fee funding is by far and away the biggest single source of funding. But things which we do through studios, it's commercial growth potentially funded by further borrowing, further partnerships, opportunities to monetize some of our services around the world. That sort of growth in the BBC world reach is significant. That could be further monetized. And then the sort of arrangements on rights. So one of the things that surprised me on arrival at the BBC, I was sort of aware of this, but I grew up in a world where the BBC made everything itself, and therefore it had control of its rights. So the archive was something that could be exploited. When those rules changed some years ago, it created the independent production sector. But the BBC doesn't have control of the rights of most of the content that it airs. And so that's one of the challenges here, is how do we get value for licence fee payers in that world? The production sector is wonderful, and you had representatives here very positive about the BBC, so we want to continue to support the independent production sector, but we should look at how do we make sure in doing so that we also get value for licence fee payers.
Yeah, thank you. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. Can I just ask Matt on this? We've spoken quite a lot during these evidence sessions. We've done quite a few of them now, and a recurring theme seems to be around sweating the assets and whether the BBC is actually doing everything it can with some of the property and intellectual property, physical property, etc., that it has at its disposal. A few weeks in, what's your headline view on that?
I mean, as you'd expect, because of the squeeze on funding, I'm looking at everything we can do on costs that doesn't impact programming and audiences. I looked into property, and actually over the last 10 years, the BBC has reduced its square footage across the country by 50%. I think there's further that we can go, and you and I've talked about the utilisation of offices around the country, and I think there's more we can do, potentially opening up some of those. So in Birmingham, we have a new Digbeth building which is bringing a lot of value to the economy, opening those things up to creators. One of the opportunities for the BBC is to get closer to the world of online creators and bring them in. It's also the case that although we still need studios to produce great drama and some of our news outputs, you need much less capital to produce great content. Anybody who's been on a podcast, almost all of us have, or streamed to our constituents, will know that you can now, with a smartphone, reach a global audience. So I think we need to look at ways in which we operate on a lighter touch basis. So in a world of cost challenge, I want to make sure that the BBC supports local content and local news.
Yeah.
One of the ways of doing that would be to try to find ways to save costs on some of the linear output, but reach more audiences more locally.
Yeah.
And that would be a win if we could do that.
I would refer you to have a look at some of the evidence we got from Dino Sophos from Persephonica.
Yes.
He's got a view that actually you should be using the assets rather than scaling back on them, actually looking at them, how they can be a way of driving revenue with it.
Yeah, I've spoken to Dino, and actually we just had his podcast festival up in Sheffield. Some of my colleagues attended, and many of our podcast presenters. I think he's right. And again, coming from my world of technology, it wasn't just about technology. YouTube was a huge platform for creators and creativity, and connecting the two, I think, is something that we can do. There are many amazingly talented British creators who want to work with the BBC, so that's something I'm looking at doing.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Let's move to Natasha, please.
Hi, thanks very much for coming in today. So we're just kind of picking up on that theme around the size and scale and shape of the BBC going forward. Do you think the BBC needs to do less? Should it be smaller?
I think it depends on the remit in the charter. So you could definitely have a BBC that did less. I don't think it would live up to its current remit. And some of the things I mentioned on education and so on. The local democracy reporting service, we haven't touched on that, something dear to my heart. On my second day of my little internship, I went and visited that team in Birmingham. They are supporting 1,000 local media outlets with journalism. About 165 jobs have been created around that. So there are things like that, I think, that you might lose if you were a smaller BBC. We need to be more efficient. One of the challenges that we face is in being universal is we have to run all of our linear services as well as all of our digital services, as well as go on third-party platforms. So that increases the cost in order to be universal.
Can I add to that? I think it's a really fair question, and we have been constantly addressing what we should stop doing. The important thing from the board's point of view is that, as Matthew said, we are transforming the BBC to be a player in this new digital landscape that we're facing. That transformation will change the nature, size and shape of the BBC. It's important that as and when we stop doing this, it's part of an overall plan, that there's a strategic vision of what the nature of the BBC is in terms of the new charter, and so the actions being taken to stop doing things are part of that plan and not some arbitrary, let's cut this or let's cut that. It's got to be organised, it's got to be strategic, because that way, and it's got to be in the public interest. If the public is not interested in something, we should think about it, but it's always got to be part of the plan. We're moving from a linear position to a digital one. That will change the shape of it and be the right size to deliver the remit that the World Charter will ask us.
I think, Matt, in your opening comments, you talked about the BBC being a trusted voice, especially in news, and I think one of our colleagues will come on to the World Service and things like that later. But given that, and the cuts that are being made to the workforce and to the shape of the BBC, and given that that's a priority for the government to ensure that the BBC stays a trusted voice, how are those cuts sort of being fairly done in say, the news department? It seems like some figures point to maybe like a 15% cut within the staff within the news team.
Yeah.
So how do you protect
Yes.
the sort of trusted voice and the kind of battling misinformation that really only the BBC can do?
I'm really aware that BBC News and BBC journalism, although some issues in the last year or so, remains the most trusted. And since I've been there, I've seen two high-impact panoramas. I've seen Ed Thomas's investigation of high streets resulting in policy change. So there's some incredible journalism going on there. So no cut in our staffing or services is an easy one to make. The best way we can do this is to have two things. One, a set of principles which I mentioned earlier, which is to kind of minimise audience impact, so to kind of maximise the highest value things we do for audiences, to look at ways to reduce duplication and make the BBC more agile and fit for the future. But you're absolutely right. One of the reasons I think we're in a moment of real jeopardy, not just for the BBC, but for Britain and for public service broadcasting. It's a unique asset for us, and that's why a universal, sufficient and scale funding solution is really critical. We will have to continue to make cuts. Can I just address your question on sort of news specifically, because various figures have been reported in the press. So each part of the BBC has a different cost structure. So in news, we make our own programming, we are our own content, sort of top to bottom, from the journalists you see on screen or listen to on radio through to the trucks and the technical services and the distribution. In other content, typically we're commissioning from other people. So the cost structures are very, very different. So you're right, if you're having to make savings, there are more likely to be savings to do with people and programmings where we're making our own programs. On the content side, we can scale back on some of that investment. Indeed, Kate Phillips, our brilliant head of content, announced about 8% reduction in budget for independent productions, which obviously impacts the sector, which is a huge source of value to the UK as well.
I suppose the question will be, what's the public service value in outbidding commercial broadcasters for things like Scooby-Doo when you could be reinvesting in British content and news?
I'm smiling because I asked exactly that question. So when I grew up, maybe some of you are the similar kind of age, biggest shows on the BBC were Dallas and Dynasty. Right, so they were big imports.
There are also only 4 channels then, so
right. Absolutely, but they were importing a lot, even in a world of 4 channels with guaranteed audiences in the 17 million plus range. Where we are today is spend on buying content like that is less than 5% of the content budget. And you mentioned Scooby-Doo, which I also loved growing up, along with Newsround. Why would we buy Scooby-Doo? Well, because people come to us for Scooby-Doo, but they stay for Horrible Histories. Right, they stay for Newsround, they stay for some of the public service content. So in selective places, I think that has value in the strategy, I've understood that. I do want to look at that further in the context of the savings we need to make sure that we're getting the balance right, but it's part of a deliberate strategy to serve audiences.
And you said you asked the same question about Scooby-Doo. Who did you ask?
I asked my colleagues.
Which,
I asked the content team under Kate Phillip, who's responsible for making those purchases.
I presumed colleagues. I wasn't thinking you were asking yourself.
Yes, so sorry, I wasn't sure what you were asking. Kate Phillips.
You were asking the buyers why they were buying it, or the strategy people.
Well, I asked Kate Phillips because her team is responsible for both the strategy and the commissioning of content.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand why that was a practice.
Yeah.
I thought the answer I got was compelling, but I also need to look at that particular less than 5% of spend. Is that the right justification in a world of reducing resources?
Okay, thanks, Damien.
Thank you. Thanks, Cara. So you say people come... we're not going to turn this into a whole hour about Scooby-Doo, but you say people come for Scooby-Doo
yes, we'd love that.
and they stay for Horrible Histories, they stay for Newsround. So that may have been true in a world of channels.
Yeah.
But you're not in a world of channels now, are you? You're in a world of select and click. So, do we have evidence that is true? That people, because you have... And it's not that you bought Scooby-Doo. I think that's not what surprised this committee, is that you outbid others using license fee.
As I say, that's something I'm looking at reviewing as part of the cost savings. I think there is data to show that audiences do follow through on viewing like that, and there is still, amongst families, linear TV is still a key part of our reach. So we can't not do that. I do think iPlayer, when it launched, was an excellent product. It launched in the UK ahead of Netflix. One of the things that I noticed of the BBC on arrival, this is an organisation that pioneered radio and its content, it pioneered television and its content, and it pioneered streaming. And in recent years, the investment in content has been a little bit at the expense of technology. So I would expect iPlayer to be able to do a better job on recommendation.
I think we're going to come back to iPlayer probably a little bit later in the session, but can I bring you back now to Bite Size, which you mentioned? So I think Bite Size is a great product. I have been known to use it myself.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it's widely appreciated by many of its users, recognised as a quality product. But what do you say to people who say to you, well, that may all be true, it's just not your job. You're a broadcaster. What are you doing creating online bite-sized content in a marketplace which does exist? Schools buy content in to support their programmes of study, and even the Department for Education funds Oak National Academy. It's not exactly the same thing, but covers the same broad range of curriculum. You're a broadcaster, Matt Britton. Why are you in that market?
3 words: inform, educate, entertain. The middle, I won't use my fingers, the middle of those words is educate. And if you
hang on, why aren't you running comedy clubs then?
Let me just answer your question. In the context of education, Bite Size is accessed by 80% plus of secondary school children.
Yeah.
Actually, Bite Size is in jeopardy because of AI.
Yeah.
Bite Size is in jeopardy because people are using it for the emergency physics learning. I don't know if you remember that. I certainly do. I wish we'd had Bite Size at the time. What's happening now is because of AI, people are going to chatbots for that. They're not getting the same quality. What I'd love to do...
Forgive me. I accepted all the stuff about it being a great product and all the rest of it. That's not in dispute.
You're saying we shouldn't
The question is just, is it your job? And although entertain, inform, educate, sure, but British Broadcasting Corporation is also the name of the organisation.
I mean, look, I think one of the challenges is broadcasting. Like, what does it mean to be a broadcaster? It used to mean radio, then it meant television, then it meant television and streaming. Now, actually, a lot of our audience is coming to us for online services. So So think about World Service, we'll come on to World Service, but a big share of our World Service audience and growth comes from online access. So I think broadcasting it's a bit like television. What is television when we're watching video? So I think these words get in the way of understanding what we need to be doing, which is serving the audience with public value.
May I
Please do.
push back? You said the BBC is a broadcaster. I said earlier, BBC is much more than a broadcaster. It has a role to play in our cultural and civic life. That's really important. That's why inform, educate and entertain is part of that. And indeed, I would say we're even more important in terms of media literacy about what children receive, that the BBC is there informing and educating our younger generation through bite size and everything else to help them navigate what is a really difficult world they're entering. And I think the BBC's role as a national broadcaster and a public good
I think you've conflated two things there, Samir. So media literacy and discerning verifiable news source and so on is different from the discussion about bite size. So the question I was just raising was, at a time when you're having a review of the licence fee and what should be the size and scope of the BBC, that is, I would argue, is definitely a matter for debate.
Yeah. I think that's all a matter for debate under the Charter.
And you mentioned the World Service. I just wanted to pick you up on something you said in your introductory words, that the BBC had now reached a global reach of 500 million users a week. These are not like-for-like statistics. So when you see charts that show this huge growth over 10 years, you're comparing an old world of people tuning in to, I mean, not exclusively, but tuning into a half-hour programme on the BBC World Service. I think today, to count as reach, the user only has to have seen your content for 10 seconds during the course of the week. So my question to you is the BBC World Service gaining market share or losing market share to RT, the Chinese service, and indeed the Turkish service?
So there's quite a lot wrapped into your question. One is measurement. You're absolutely right. There are different ways of measuring across different platforms. One of the things I'm looking to do at the BBC is to clarify and simplify what we mean by reach that's of value. So if you're in the world of TikTok, when they're selling advertising, that is a view. I mean, obviously that's nonsense from the BBC standpoint, but it's also.
I think that's in your. If someone dwells for 10 seconds, I think that is in your 500 million.
Yeah. So one of the things we need to do, as I say, is clarify what we mean by that. But I do think that when you look at the numbers, obviously the averages hide a huge impact economically. So it's undeniable that the BBC's reach internationally with this 500 million figure is relevant. We know that people who consume the BBC, and that's a weekly figure, we know that people who consume the BBC are more likely to invest in the UK, more likely to travel to the UK, and critically, I think, more likely to come here for education. And we really need the best people to come here for education in order to fight back against the sort of AI tyranny that's coming from the concentration of power. So I accept your kind of point about measurement. It actually becomes quite difficult to measure across all these different services in a consistent way, but it's definitely part of what we should look at.
I think, to be fair, in what you've just quoted, there was also a question about direction of causality. I don't think you can demonstrate that because somebody tuned into a BBC programme, they decided they were going to come and study in the UK.
We've got a survey that says that people who consume the content are more likely to do those.
I agree.
Those things.
There remains a question about direction of causality. It's also possible that people who are interested in the English language and interested in Britain are both more likely to study in the UK and to consume BBC content. I'm done.
Correlation, not a causality.
Indeed. Thank you.
Hi, and welcome to the committee. You're still in the honeymoon period, I guess.
There's quite a lot in the in-tray.
And it's a big old load of stuff you take on 39 local radio stations that people treat as their friends.
It's just in England. Yes.
Yeah, children's TV, World Service, all this stuff. I just wondered, rather than asking what bits are you going to cut, and you come from a commercial background, which is welcome in some ways, why do you think the financial situation got so bad? Because kind of from day one you were sending these emails of doom that send a shiver down the spine of every staff member. Is it they need better financial planning? Because it sounds like, all these things we talk about, black holes and tough choices, you're having to do those.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I don't want to repeat what I said earlier. Tim Davie had already announced prior to his departure that the BBC needed to make 10% savings. prior to his departure. I explained over the 10 years the 1.2, 1.3 billion pounds of reduction in licence fee funding. That's about 24% of licence fee over 10 years, mostly due to price freezes and increasing the work the BBC was asked to do by the government. And then about 40% of that reduction was due to reduction in households paying. So that gap opened up as a result of those changes. And the BBC had chosen to spend its cash reserves and dividends from its commercial business on plugging that gap. We've reached the point where that's no longer possible.
How can you avoid that happening again? Because it sounds like it's a lot worse than expected from the emails you've been sending in. Is there a plan to kind of tackle evasion? Because at the moment, the people who do pay it are subsidising people who watch it for free on iPlayer. Could you do a more explicit advert that for effectively pennies every day, you're getting all this?
Yes, it's 50p a day. It's £15 a month. I mean, that compares with the Times. So you can have a newspaper for £15 a month, or you have all the BBC. The universality is the difference, right? And so the licence fee unit and our teams already do a lot to try to close the gap. But the challenge is that the measures they take are proving less effective as generations change and habits change. And that's one of the reasons that the funding settlement under this charter is absolutely the heart of the BBC being able to continue to operate in the way that it does at scale. So yes, we can and should be doing as much as possible on licence fee collection under the current model, but it's yesterday's model. It's a busted flush. It's no longer fit for purpose, and that's why we need to make the case for the BBC and a shift of the licence fee model.
I mean, the 1% offer has been rejected by the unions. I think it's gone to arbitration.
We're talking about pay now.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you motivate your staff? I'm ex-staff myself. I've still got members of my family who are employed in the BBC. And they kind of say to me that, you know, they see their colleagues being axed and slashed, so morale is low. The town hall meetings they feel ignored at.
What, sorry?
The town hall meetings, I don't know if you've presided over one of those
Conducted
yet.
too, yeah.
They can sort of, those things. They kind of feel ignored, that they submit questions, they get battered away, those sort of things.
Please encourage them to email me directly. I'm answering all the questions of colleagues. You mentioned pay. In a world where we have to cut £500 million from the BBC's budget, by the way, £500 million is equivalent of more than the entire film and drama budget of the BBC. It's more than the budget for news. It's more than the budget for sport. So it's a significant amount of saving. In a world where we have to do that, I do think colleagues accept that we will have to make change. One of the things I'm most impressed by is colleagues at the BBC are there because they believe in the mission. And they know it's tough, and they see what's happening around the world. And these are very informed colleagues. So we're in negotiation. We haven't reached the end of the negotiation on pay. I think it's reasonable to offer an increase, but we can't afford an increase at the scale that people might like. My job is to do two things: come in and make sure that we are operating within the envelope we currently have, argue for a better funding solution for the future, but also to reshape the BBC, as Samir says, for the future. And so that depends on what the Charter asks us to do. But you're absolutely right. If we want the BBC to continue to be brilliant journalistically, creatively and technically, we need people to want to come and work there and build careers there. And so that's what I'm looking at as I'm trying to make the strategy for the future.
What I would say is that, first of all, the 500 million is a big number. But that's on top of 700 million we announced earlier when I first joined the BBC. I think what that really reveals is the funding gap. And as you said, there's been a freeze on licence fees, and that's why it's so important that the new funding model actually deals with this. That it's a stable revenue stream, which it isn't. It's like this. As the revenue stream goes down like this and the costs go up, that gap gets bigger and bigger. We just need to fix that. Otherwise, we will be in a constant state of trying to cut things to meet that revenue. So what will fix that is, as we say, a sustainable, off-scale, reliable revenue stream. Yes. And I cannot emphasize too much that the new funding model needs to do that. Otherwise, we will be in this constant cycle of having to cut to live within our means.
How many people have taken up the opportunity of having a licence fee since you've had QR codes on the World Cup matches?
We've seen, I can't give you the precise numbers, but thank you for prompting. So some of the measures they've been doing have been under the World Cup, pushing the fact that you need to have a licence fee, need to pay a licence fee to watch this. And there has been a lift in licence fee payment. We've seen that with other big sporting events. By the way, if you're interested, I had a bet with Samir on Monday how many people watched the match in the middle of the night. 9.1 million people, the biggest ever audience at that time of day, watched live.
Wow.
Another 5 million people watched on catch-up on iPlayer. Another 1.1 million people watched on BBC Two. So it's a good example, I think, of something that brings the nation together, even in this world of technical fragmentation. And I think, you know, the BBC, part of what the BBC does is bringing people together, and we really value that role.
Have you made any calculation as to what percentage of that 9 million people don't actually have a licence fee?
Well, if you were to just assume it's in line with the total population, we've got 94% of adults watching, but only 80% of households paying. So that's the size of the gap. And as I say, if we look at a mechanism, ideally you'd have all the people consuming would be paying, or you just make it fully universal as it was previously when, you know, if you bought a radio, you paid a license.
And it is fairer to the 80% who do pay the license fee for the 14% who don't but consume it. So I think it is an attempt to be fairer about what we produce.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. The BBC Charter states that the BBC must be independent in all matters concerning the fulfilment of its mission and the promotion of public services. The BBC's independence from the government has been highlighted as of great importance to audiences. In a public survey by the BBC, Our Future, found 91% of respondents agreed that it is important that the BBC is independent from the government of the day. Dr. Shah, the Culture Secretary, appears to agree with you that the BBC should have a permanent charter. So with a permanent charter, what aspects of the relationship between the BBC and the government would still be debated, and how often?
It'll still be
debated, and how often?
Thank you for that. Well, as you know, as the chair, I act in the public interest, and there's nothing more important, as you point out in our survey, that the public wants the BBC to be independent. That is its principal reason, and particularly independent of government. One of the reasons I've raised in my November speech, some of the chair will remember, back in Leeds in 2024, that we should consider whether we should lose the permanent charter, lose the 10-year limit and have a permanent charter, because it will benefit both the public, the government, and the BBC, because then we will not be every few years facing an existential crisis about the BBC, and that just is not a very helpful thing. Now, it's not helpful for many reasons. Let me just identify 2 or 3. First of all, just let me say, this is not special treatment. Every single, as far as I'm aware, organisation created by the Royal Charter does not have a time limit. Only the BBC has. Why? There's no reason for it. It just enters. We have negotiation, discussion with government with this first question, which is, why should you exist? It doesn't happen. That's not a helpful start to any relationship. I think the other reason is that there are practical reasons. This cliff edge means that we cannot have any long-term strategic planning. We can't have contracts where we can get value out of having discounts for longer contracts. Yeah. But what it isn't is to shy away from accountability. Some of our other ideas is about strengthening accountability. So what a permanent charter does is strengthen both the independence and, attached to some of our other ideas, make us more accountable to the public, to Parliament. What we do not want, and that's the problem with the 10-year rule, that the government of the day can simply, passively, not produce a charter and the BBC ceases to exist. I'm not suggesting the BBC has a right to exist. It does not. But if you decide to abolish the BBC, it should be a national debate involving the public, Parliament, and then Parliament can legislate or to revoke the Royal Charter. It needs to be a public, proactive decision, not something that happens by default.
Okay, but going back to my question, with a permanent charter, what aspects of the relationship between the BBC and the government would still be debated, and how often?
A great deal. We will always be, and this is about accountability, we're not talking about not discussing over whatever is the right time period, discussing its remit, its scope, how we're regulated, because the world is changing dramatically. And as the world changes, we need to be able to have a conversation with the government and the public and Parliament about how we change the BBC. I do not want to change any ability to rethink the point, purpose, remit, scope. But what we don't want is this cliff edge, which just really is a very damaging and limiting thing.
Okay. There have been some controversies about appointments of non-executive BBC board members, and including Sir Robbie Gibb. Do you support the appointment of non-executive BBC board members by an independent body?
We've said, and I do think that, again, I raised this very early on in my speech, that one of the important things is to demonstrate independence. And in terms of optics, when the government of the day appoints 5 non-executive directors, including the chair, that damages that notion in optics of independence. It's really important that those appointments are made publicly, openly, transparently. Absolutely does involve the government and indeed the national parliament, but it should be open like any public appointment. And that will help make us not just appear, but also be more independent.
Okay, if the BBC continues to be funded by a licence fee, do you support the licence fee level being determined by an independent body?
I do. I think there are 2 very strong levers the government has. One is the determination of what the quantum of the licence fee is, because that affects our ability to scale. And also, the government of the day, the Treasury, receives the money gathered and then takes whatever top slicing they want. As we know famously, the Chancellor under George Osborne took out all sorts of money, top sliced it and gave us less. Those are 2 very important levers, and I think it should be an independent body determining that.
If I may, I looked at some of the facts on this because I'm interested to understand. Yeah. And freezing the licence fee is effectively a cutting cost, because if production costs are inflating at 7% per annum as they are now, frozen, effectively you're losing 7% in 1 year. And in 9 of the last 16 years, the licence fee has been frozen. And I think that's something that if you're trying to run an organisation, whatever the overall settlement is, having some level of predictability rather than having to cut. Dr. Huck asked rightly so about cost cuts, wage rate increases and so on, how we get the best talent. Operating an organisation when you're subject to that level of uncertainty around income is a challenge, and the licence fee level and the fact that 9 out of 16 years has been frozen is a challenge.
There was a report a few days ago that said that the BBC has abandoned hope of clawing back the £200,000 that was paid to Hugh Edwards. Is that true? And how do you think that licence fee payers will feel about that?
Well, I've already said that I think Hugh Edwards ought to return the money. He hasn't done so. I read that he's seeking some kind of redemption, or he's coming out. I think one very good step in that, if he has an ounce of moral rectitude, he would return the money. He hasn't done so, and I think he should.
But is it true that you've abandoned hope of actually getting the money back?
No, we have not abandoned hope. No, this is a serious amount of money. It belongs to the licence payer. It does not belong to Hugh Edwards.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Liz. Vicky.
Yeah, we were talking about board members, and just wondering whether or not you've got any plans or would support making sure that we get more employees on the board, because we talk about people feeling disenfranchised perhaps at times, but also the cold face of what actually works well in an organisation. So I just wondering your thoughts on that.
I think I heard that in the discussions. I think it's a really interesting observation. We already have a mechanism by which I think it's quite important that we hear what young people think about what the BBC does, because it's their future, and we have a next generation group. My thinking about that was, actually, we don't hear enough from them about what they think about it, and we need to listen more. I think worker representation is another good area. I don't want to be negative about it, but it's quite a big task if you have one member who represents the whole of the 20,000.
There needs to be one.
But I think we need to. I absolutely agree that just as much as we need to hear what the next generation think what we're doing at the BBC, so we need to hear what our workforce is doing and maybe make that a bit more precise and systematic. I support that idea of building that.
Can I just, how are you currently monitoring how employees feel?
There's an employee. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add. So there's an employee survey that tells us how employees feel. It shows some progress on things like culture, which Samir and others have put in place quite a big program around increasing the sort of safety that people feel to call out bad behaviours. And I've seen data that suggests real progress on that, both in terms of cases, but also in terms of employee sentiment. So that's one lever. To the earlier question, I'm open to reshaping the BBC in a way that modernises it. I've seen lots of different models across Europe as well on employee representation. They may and may not work in different ways. I think it's a fundamental part of your leadership task as a manager to be well engaged with employees. That's why I spent 6 weeks going around the country listening to people in the front line. I met, I think, almost all of our 1,000 apprentices who were brilliant. We have a next generation committee that are sort of rising talent that the whole of the EXCO, the management team, listened to the other day. And I'm looking again at how we engage coming in fresh. In my previous role, a lot of employee engagement, and I think hearing direct from employees at senior management level, fundamentally important. Final point on that is, in a world where organisations are changing fast and are subject to much greater uncertainty, whether it's government or companies or organisations like ours, the more you communicate, the better. And actually, you need to hear from the front line to lead properly. So I think it's important. How we resolve that is up for grabs.
And I've said this before. One way I personally do it is every month I have a lunch with about 15 junior staff. It's just no agenda, and I've now done that over 20 times now, and I get a very, very interesting response from what the BBC looks like from where they are. Quite often they raise the culture review. That's been something that they're now aware of. But everything. And what's interesting is that when it first started, people were slightly, not shy exactly, but they didn't quite know what was going on. But now that I've done it and it's gone round, they come straight in and tell me what they think. And it's a really helpful, useful thing to hear.
So I totally agree in terms of engagement with employees, but we all know that in terms of on the board, there is a lot more information that is shared quite often on a confidential basis and so forth. So I'm talking about making sure that that next level of engagement is, and whether or not, in principle, obviously work out the numbers, etc., and who it is and so forth, not suggesting that we prescribe that here, but whether or not in principle, that principle would be something. And I'm being shooed along by the chair, so a yes or no is absolutely fine.
Yes is that, my answer to that.
It's not for me, it's for the chair to decide that.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Did you want to come in on that? No. Rupert, thank you.
Yeah, what's the rationale of inclusion for the 15 staff lunch? Because I don't think I know anyone who's been to
I'm sorry, say that?
How do you pick the 15 people? Because you have thousands and thousands of employees. Yes. So how do you finger
it's a good question. When I first started that was how do you pick them? And we debated about whether it should be some one division or it should be a mix of people. I don't pick them. I just want them just to be...
Okay, it doesn't seem a very good sampling strategy. I think you should go wider.
It's a way in which I can hear directly from junior staff.
How do you pick them? What's the sampling strategy?
So I ask the people who run the staff to come, to bring people to the lunch.
Right.
It's just a...
Because when you have an Ofsted, I've taught before, you select the students that the inspectors speak to. So anyway...
I don't want them to think they've been specially chosen to perform in front of the chair. I just want...
I don't understand how they're picked. That's all.
Just Dr. Hart, I think is one of an array of ways of making sure leadership here from staff. So a widespread staff survey is another way. You're absolutely right. Going and looking at employees from all backgrounds across the country from all functions is another. An informal approach is another. But you're absolutely right. You know, one of the most important things in an organisation is the engagement of frontline staff and the fact that the leadership team knows what it's like in the front line.
Right, okay. And Matt, I do want to say it's refreshing having you here because your predecessor was always in that chair apologising for some mistake or something. So
I'm only 6.5 weeks in.
Yeah, it's good that we're getting off to a good start with you. It was, I don't know, Tim Westwood, Greg Wallace, sort of so many things. Trump, obviously, was the end of him and the cherry-picked dossier. You guys have signed up to CISA, haven't you? The bad behaviour body. Good.
I actually have a meeting on that later today, I think, or tomorrow.
It'd be great if that had some more teeth. They've spoken to us before, but it was a sort of closed meeting. Because,
look, I think I think some really good progress has been made on culture, both on what employees feel about it and what I see. But there's a lot more to do. Any large organisation needs to constantly work at that. It's never a completed project to ensure that the culture is inclusive, supportive, and the behaviour standards are high.
I did want to ask a little about what happens when mistakes occur. I mean, sometimes we have the situation where it's a production company, it's an unclear chain of command whose fault that was. Everyone sees it as the BBC because they switch it on. Even, I know we said they don't switch on devices, but it comes with your branding, so people don't understand that was, should there be more vetting there? So those kind of things, and transparency as well.
Sorry, what was the question?
So, what are you going to do to ensure that you're not always sitting in there apologising for some mistake like the last guy did?
It's a very good question. I mean, the first thing to say is no organisation can rule out mistakes completely. I think we need to start with that premise. However, on my first day, before I went through the door, I said, make the case for the BBC, editorial excellence and velocity. On editorial excellence, I spoke to several previous DGs, several previous heads of news, previous Deputy Director General to understand how things had operated and what I needed to do. I opened the role of a Deputy Director General on arrival and appointed 4 weeks later Rodri Taufin-Davies to play that role, somebody who's been at the BBC, began as a journalist and has a good understanding of the organisation. That's helpful as somebody coming from the outside. The remit there is to assist in ensuring when there are issues, whether it's operational, editorial or corporate, that they're immediately gripped within a rigorous framework. I think that's one of the challenges has been if things happen, there's been not necessarily enough accountability and clarity on it. So he's going to help to ensure that we put in place something. Also, I think, if you make a mistake, it's really important to be quick. One of the things that I'm looking at is velocity. If we make a mistake, we should own it, we should apologise for it immediately, and then we should sort of say what we're going to do to try to understand what went wrong or to address it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm very clear on from the start. And, so watch this space. I hope that we will live up to that promise.
The editorial standards, the ESCG committee, James Harding, who gave us evidence, he's ex-Today programme and now The Observer.
He was the editor of BBC News, I think.
Yeah, so he knows his stuff. He said that there's a big concern that this Star Chamber, it's only 4 people deciding on the entire news output of your corporation. It's a disproportionate amount of influence on their shoulders, and Robbie Gibb, who's a very partisan figure, wields a lot of influence.
Can I say one thing and then ask Dr. Shah to comment on that?
I know there's 2 new people on there, but again, I think they're a bit corporate.
So I want to clarify one thing before Samir sort of clarifies what changes he's made to the Editorial Standards Committee. It's not the role of the Editorial Standards Committee to commission journalism or to run journalism. It's got a retrospective review role on thematic areas. So the news organisation is run ultimately by me and the head of news. We're in the process of appointing a new one. That's the role of the board committee is very different from commissioning and running the news day to day. But you can then maybe clarify what
their role was to hold the news executives to account.
Yeah, it's there to ensure that the editorial standards are maintained, but not on a proactive basis. They're not saying you should be doing this. They're reviewing what's happened.
Yeah. So the Editorial Standards Committee, the changes to the Editorial Standards Committee were part of a series of changes we made in the light of the events of last year. We had a number of changes under personnel and policies and practices. Editorial Standards Committee is one of them. We reviewed its working. We reduced where it failed. And the new editorial standards, it's a different remit, different scope. It's got broadened its membership.
New people, I've noticed.
There are more people have been added to it to get a variety of opinions, and it's what I would say it's got more teeth in the sense that action will be taken. It'll be quick. It'll be decisive, and we will be tracking that action. So there's a wholly new approach to reviewing output.
I mean, James Harding said that you've got this very closely identified partisan figure who's the most senior person on there because Deborah Turness and Tim Davie went. And the 2 new appointments, they both seem to be corporate people. I don't think it is reflecting, as we said, the staff base, the panoply of people that it could, different opinions.
I can't agree with that. I think the people who are now sit around the Editorial Standards Committee are very serious, experienced people. The executives would be that.
From PwC, one from...
But those are the external advisors. They're not members of the committee. We've changed it, but we've actually changed the members of the committee. Both the Neds
Is it possible to get the detail of that to us? Because for a licensed payer and
it's not a secret. I will give you the details.
And then just the other thing, I am disappointed that I sent an email to you, Matt, and to the Director General address. I don't know who answers your emails on your behalf, but the answer I got didn't resemble what I asked for. So in the minutes, there's a plan for reform voters, and it talks about a presentation was seen. I wanted to see the presentation slides of that. Yes. They were not provided. The answer I got said I replied to Dame Caroline on so. It wasn't a Dame Caroline thing. I was asking, she's a separate person to me. Yeah. I was asking to see the plan for reform voters. Is there a plan for all voters? Surely trust issues are falling with all.
May I answer your several questions? So, firstly, I got your letter last week. Thank you for alerting me to the concerns.
I just thought it was nice to tell you in advance. Let's spring it on you.
So I looked into it immediately, and what I found was you'd asked about a conversation at the board that was reported in minutes that referred to reform voters. And you'd written to Tim Davey, my predecessor, about this, and he'd responded to you. And I looked at the response and agreed with the response, which I then referred you to. I think what you're asking about is, does the BBC look through a lens of voting intent when it looks at its audience? And actually, that's one of many lenses that we look at. We look at backgrounds, we look at geography, we look at ethnicity, because our obligations are to serve audiences universally. And so I believe that they have looked at the lens on voting intent from time to time when they felt that they were adrift of things, but it's only one of many lenses. You specifically asked to see confidential board papers, and that's not a practice that we would support, because boards need to operate using confidential papers. But I can assure you I've seen no evidence of a sort of bias in that area in the time that I've been there, and I've asked about that. So you may not be happy with the answer, but that unfortunately is the answer.
I thought you were stressing transparency, so I'm disappointed we can't.
Well, we
see
cannot,
the
no
presentation.
company or organisation reveal all of its board papers. I think that's reasonable practice.
I mean, all right, I'll just finish here, but I'll just say there is a danger that because we all want growth, don't we? So if we just go for cuts, and I totally take your point that Nadine Dorries should not have frozen the licence fee. That was catastrophic.
I think many
for your...
many ministers did. I don't think there's one.
So, in the last government. But if you have cuts, you get less licence fee payers. People say, ITV Studio is much nicer than your tacky one with a few plants in Salford. People see it's not as high quality. So if you get cuts, you get less licence fee payers. You have a plan for reform voters, and then people like GB News and Reform are emboldened on your defund campaigns. Then mistakes get made in the news, and this is what happens. It brought down your predecessor. The news team are overstretched.
I don't want to leave the impression that there's a sort of plan for reform voters. There's a plan to ensure, using multiple different lenses, that we serve our audiences in line with our charter obligations, and that's what we do. We might look at a whole array of different ways of understanding behaviours. And by the way, those behaviours are changing very fast, not just in media habits, but in terms of the polarisation of society. And one of the key roles we need to secure for the public service room at the BBC is to bring people together, and that's what we're looking at doing.
So, can I take us back to some of the scandals that, as she says, we are certainly separate people, despite the plain similarities. But she's right. You raised a number of the issues, the scandals that have hit the BBC over since our time as a select committee. One of the things that Stuart Purvis said to us, former editor-in-chief at ITM, he said when a problem first arises, the new Director General will have to make a decision about whether he will speak for the BBC or whether he's going to ask someone, a deputy, to speak on his behalf. Have you given any thought to how... I think we inevitably know that one day there will be an issue that arises that you have to...
There will be something unforeseen for sure.
So have you given any thought to how you might sort of choreograph a response to future issues?
Yes. So I appointed deputy 2.5 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, and so we're just working through what's the best way to address the issue of that role and how it operates around any kind of crisis or incident, whether it's editorial, operational or corporate. His role will be to lead the response on behalf of the corporation, not necessarily the public response. Depends on the seriousness. I'd expect you would want to hear from me in the case of something very serious, but there are all kinds of issues that come up all the time. So I think given the scale of the BBC and its output, and also the scrutiny that it has uniquely ahead of anyone else in the media sector, we need to make sure that we have that sort of approach to understanding the risks and what the appropriate response, both publicly and operationally. So we're working on putting that in place. It's not fully established because we're only just getting started. I think it's important. That's part of dealing with the response. The other part, though, Chair, is about ensuring the conditions are there so that we can take big risks and be bold in our journalism and creativity while being held to the right standards that you'd expect from the BBC. So we want to make sure that we've got the conditions in place as well on that. And I've been impressed by things like the editorial guidelines, but the world's moving so fast we need to modernise what we do. And I've talked about, for example, when criticised, it's hard for me to pull data on, how many times did we cover a particular story, and I want to make sure that we can do that better and faster.
Right. And you mentioned in your early comments to us about velocity being one of your catchphrases.
Hopefully it's something I can bring.
Catchwords.
I hope it becomes more than that.
And I think that actually that's the difference between something become, in some cases, an issue being a big issue or a lesser issue, the speed at which it's dealt with.
Yes, I mean, and it goes down to a small level. So, I mean, I don't want to reignite this, but, a Newsnight presenter misquoted one of the political leaders recently and realised at the end of the programme that they'd done so. They and the programme editor contacted directly the person, apologised. We apologised publicly, and we pulled the episode immediately from iPlayer. And I think that's a good example of owning something, taking immediate action, and moving on. And I think, that's a small example, but I think it's part of the ethos we need to have. I think the other part of the ethos that's really important to me is that when you're scrutinised, that's an opportunity to improve, not an opportunity to be defensive. So we should rightly and robustly defend ourselves when we think we're in the right and we've got the facts to hand. But we should also look at when there are problems, how can we better improve? And I think that's part of what the BBC's tried to do, but I need to make it an absolute priority in a world of polarisation and more challenge, but also more risk.
Do you take learning from other misfortunes that happen to other broadcasters? I mean, for example, if you were Channel 4, would you ever bring back Married at First Sight, or would you keep it off the books?
I'm not going to speak for the CEO of Channel 4, but that was exposed by brilliant journalism by Panorama. By the way, a horrific experience for the brave women involved, and credit to them for coming forward. When the Panorama aired, and I hadn't seen the content prior, I immediately asked our team, where are we on safeguarding on these kinds of programmes? We don't have anything like that programme, to be clear, on the BBC. We have pretty good guidelines that are constantly updated, and the team, when something like that happens, looks and says, is there anything further that we could do here? I think that's right.
If you were in their shoes, I'm not asking you to talk for Channel 4, but if, say, for example, you had a programme like that on your books and it had the coverage that's had, what would your instinct be to do? To bring it back, or to just leave it?
I think you're asking me to speak for the CEO of Channel 4.
I'm asking you to talk hypothetically about what might happen if you, in your role, these issues will come up. I just want to know what kind of Director General you're going to be. Are you going to be a risk taker, or are you going to play it safe?
Fair question. I think it's unlikely we'll have a programme like that on our books because of the BBC, and our remit is about those standards across all our output, impartiality and due impartiality and care and so on. So it's unlikely we'd have something like that. But if we have a programme with an issue around safeguarding, absolutely I would look at how serious is the issue, what do we need to do to correct it, and is it sufficiently serious that actually we should stop running that programme and we should look at the roles of the people involved. So it depends on the seriousness. But ultimately, I think no programme or presenter is bigger than the corporation, particularly a corporation that is funded by the public. Yeah. And that's why I think the bar is rightly higher for the BBC. I think the scrutiny is a high level of scrutiny. Sometimes it's very polarised from people with a commercial interest in how they're covering the BBC, but I accept that responsibility. I come into this with my eyes wide open.
Thank you. Liz, you wanted to pop in on that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Matt, can I just ask you about, obviously there's been some concerns about bias, particularly on Question Time. If I can just run through some stats with you, which I know you'll be aware of. But since the start of the year, Reform has had 7 appearances on Question Time. They have 8 MPs. The Lib Dems have had 9 appearances on Question Time. They have 72 MPs. And Rachel Millward from the Green Party appeared on consecutive weeks on Question Time. Is that something that you're looking to address?
Yes. Thank you for the question. So yes, I understand the question, sorry, and let me just sort of unpack it for you. I asked the team about this in respect to the Makerfield by-election, which happened soon after I started here, and a complaint had been raised by one of the, I think it's 14 candidates standing, about not being on Question Time. Question Time has a panel, I think, of 5. And so the way in which they select panellists is a key thing that they've looked at very closely. And in fact, there was an Ofcom complaint because this was during an election period, and Ofcom ruled with the BBC that we had been fair and appropriate in the application of our guidelines. So in the context of something like Reform, as you mentioned, the MPs versus the representation, the political situation, as you all know, is changing very dynamically. And so we can't just look at historic representation in terms of numbers of seats. We also look at things like vote share, intention to vote, and so on. And the team has to make a judgment based on all of those factors. They're very clear editorial guidelines. In fact, 10.4.21 in our public editorial guidelines deal with election and its integrity, by-elections too, and obviously there's a code of practice for candidates. So that's always under very close scrutiny. It's a question I've already asked. In Makerfield, I was, and also the Ofcom adjudication was supportive of our guidelines, but we'll need to keep it under review, particularly as the situation on elections and by-elections is very dynamic.
So can we expect to see a dedicated question time on the Clacton by-election if there's only one candidate?
Well, what we'll do is enforce our guidelines, which are written to take account of any number of candidates in the case of a by-election, and two things kick in there. One, our editorial guidelines that I just quoted, and the other is the Code of Practice for Candidates, which is required by electoral law.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, Dr. Shah, I just wanted to come back to my question on Hugh Edwards, because you said that you hadn't given up hope of getting the money back. Can I just ask what you're actually doing to get the money back?
Well, we have already, as you know, we've written to Hugh, we've written to his lawyers. I can look back at what our latest one-to-one relationship is. I've certainly said it publicly. But if you ask me, what do I think the chances are? I don't know. It's a matter for Hugh, really. He really should give it back. And we will keep pushing him to do so.
Right,
I would think the licence bearer would want us to do that.
And if the licence bearer does want you to do that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with that.
There are two candidates so far in the by-election. Will Count Binface get the same amount of coverage from the BBC as Nigel Farage?
Let's not speculate because we don't know. I don't think it's even been officially called yet as a by-election, so I don't want to speculate.
Hypothetically.
But what I suggest, because I don't have the guidelines in front of me, you can look at our guidelines and we'll happily discuss when the eventuality arises, including whoever's standing. But I think that particular candidate has been interviewed in the past. May even have been interviewed in some of our output today. I'm not entirely certain.
Very good, interesting. Thank you. Who's next? Vicky? Yeah.
You may or may not be happy, but I'm going to move on to technology and innovation. So, Matt, you said how technology is extremely important. So what are the BBC priorities for developing technology and innovation? And do you think it should be for the public benefit or specifically linked to the aim of driving growth?
It's a great question, and there's a lot I could answer there because I've got some background here. I mean, I think what I've asked immediately is two things. One, that we prioritise improving iPlayer and its recommendations. So if you are making programmes for the BBC, I think it's right that those programmes are easy to find. So, for example, I really enjoyed the show Small Profits, had an audience of 8 million plus, I think. Many of you may have seen it. Great show, Greater Manchester based, exactly what the BBC should be doing. By the way, it came out of Mackenzie Crook, who was discovered on The Office. The BBC backed him in his first ever writing piece, which was Direct Detectorists. So I watched Small Profits. You'd think that it would suggest that iPlayer would suggest detectorists to me. But it doesn't. And so some of our technology investment has fallen behind where it should be. So improving the user experience or the audience experience in our digital properties is one key priority for me. Another priority is going where the audience is. So we've got to get comfortable with the BBC being seen on third-party platforms. I don't think, the current licence fee straitjacket on funding, you've got to be on iPlayer or linear to pay the licence fee, is in the way of that progress. I think we have to go past that already and make the assumption that the BBC in continuing has to reach the audiences where they are. So there's another piece there, which is ensuring that we appear on third-party platforms in the best possible way. And I mentioned BBC News now at 20 million YouTube subscribers. They've done a good job, I think, with their branding. If you go to YouTube, you can tell BBC News Red is there. People like Steve Rosenberg and our other key correspondents are there. Elsewhere in technology, there's an awful lot of other things we need to do. The use of AI is going to disrupt both the creation of content and the distribution of content. It's already doing so. And the BBC needs to be careful in using its AI in its content creation and journalism, but it needs to use it because some of the tools are really powerful in those arenas. So I've looked at, I have set up a group that's looking at what technology do we approve at greater speed for use in our production processes, both journalistic and otherwise, and also what do we do in terms of our distribution. Distribution's been complicated by chatbots, circumventing people. Google search, since I left, has now been augmented with AI summaries, so people are less likely in some cases to go through to the original content provider, be that the BBC or a newspaper. So there is a lot to do in the field of technology. It's been a bit underinvested, and we've got a lot of legacy technology that's about radio masts and linear TV broadcasting too. So the challenge is how do we maintain that, because it has to support the audience while we build these new things, and there's a job to do there.
Yeah, and one of the things that I worry about is in terms of online safety,
Yes.
particularly around younger people, but also trusted news services.
Yes.
So in terms of using more, AI and so forth, how do we also go and protect that, but also protect the trustedness of
Yes.
the BBC?
Well, I think the case for the BBC today is about what it does for audiences, what it does for the economy, which is £6.7 billion worth of economic impact, and what it does for sovereignty. And I think, when I've spoken to policymakers here and around Europe in particular in the last few years, seen lots of regulation here, the Online Safety Act, and now we have obviously the social media ban. I think that's in response to concerns about sort of technology. But tomorrow's battle on technology is all about AI. AI now, on my phone, I could generate something that looks like a Hollywood movie with just a few words. So that's a completely different world. And I think part of what we do within Charter, and this is something we've not yet talked about, is how does the BBC play its role alongside government and other institutions in equipping the UK in the battle against misinformation, digital sovereignty, information security, but also the skills for the jobs of the future. I grew up in the era of the BBC Micro, and I know that our games industry in Dundee and the DeepMind team in London and many of the unicorns that the UK is producing in this area are led by people who grew up with the BBC Micro, were inspired to become software engineers through that programme. What's the equivalent of that today? How do we help people with the skills of the future? I know Damien asked the question about education. I strongly believe that the BBC's got a big role to play in equipping ourselves in this battle for truth, which is already here.
Thank you. Stephen Knight told us that he thought the BBC should make the licence fee available internationally, so anyone could pay a licence fee and then get access to the iPlayer. What do you think?
I'd love that. Unfortunately, the complex rights issues we have around the content and its ownership means we can't do that. So we do have a platform, BritBox, in the US, which is growing strongly. I'd like to do more. The earlier question about funding opportunities for international, we would need more money, but the fundamental issue is rights. And actually went to visit Stephen in Birmingham on the set of Peaky Blinders, and he's done an incredible job capitalising on the BBC funding, then bringing in Netflix and sustaining that production industry. And I think we haven't talked enough about the role the BBC plays in regions and across the UK.
Don't worry, we're coming to
Good.
it. Don't you worry.
I just want to make sure we have the
We
chance
won't
to talk about
forget.
it, because I've
Don't
been
you
most impressed by that.
Yeah, don't
Could
forget.
I just say something about the rights? It is this issue of accessing outside the UK being limited because of rights. I think it's really important that as the committee reflects on the BBC of the future, the rights question, what happens, and I benefited from it when I was an independent producer, that the BBC commissions, but I own the rights. And that was very important in creating an independent sector. It's been incredibly successful. We have one of the best independent sectors, if not the best. But they're now consolidating, and they're very large organisations that have turnovers more than the BBC. I think we should look again at the issue of rights and how the BBC can own more of the rights when it commissions programming. So then, in a long-term strategic way, we can get to a point where BBC output can be enhanced, and people outside the BBC, outside Britain, can pay for it. And we do a bit on commercial, but I think the issue of rights is really important going forward, and whether we can change the balance of who owns the rights of content.
But do you not think that that's up to the BBC to develop them more of their own intellectual property?
We're required today, yes, we're required today to go to the market for those things, which is great, and that's produced the market. Banijay All3Media will be great. You heard from Patrick, who's brilliant. But that is now a £5 million behemoth, not a small indie. So we might want to think again about how we think about larger and smaller indies and how we operate in that, not to slow down their own investment in original content, but we should look again in the world that we're facing into. Could I ask a small favour, Chair?
Yes,
I can see a fan over there that's pointing at the wall. It's now 27 degrees. If we could rotate it so the audience behind, and maybe Dr. Shah and I could get a little bit of air.
We can do. The only problem we have is that the fans play havoc with our microphones.
Oh, do they?
And that is
I wouldn't want to stop that.
That is the issue that we have with the fans. But I do apologise to everybody.
Okay.
I mean, it is unbearably hot in here.
Right, we might just get more water
but, yeah, that's why our fan has been also pointing at the wall up until quite recently. Pointing at Andy.
Okay. Should have known that technical question.
Yeah, there you go.
Apologies.
And Jeff, you wanted to pop in?
Yeah, just on the comment you made, Matt, about the iPlayer, and that you used the example of somebody watching Small Profits. It could be directed to watch Detectorists. I mean, that, I suppose, it could be seen as a kind of sending an individual on a kind of narrow path. And the BBC in the past has always been about expanding horizons, educating. How do you strike that balance between giving the individual what they want and, I suppose, delivering the wider purpose of the BBC? Creating in the linear channel days, people will come to see Small Profits and then see something that they didn't expect.
Well, it's a great question, actually. So I didn't intend to say, you should come and watch more and more stuff like you're watching. I think that recommendation engine on iPlayer should be a public service recommendation engine. Just like scheduling in a linear channel, the scheduler was making a decision, at the end of this big show, if we put in this good for you show, people will stay tuned. I mean, obviously that's a huge generalization. But a recommendation engine, I've been on iPlayer for 20 plus years. It's suggesting some things to me that I've never watched and would never watched. So I think it's trying to find something that learns more. And, one of the reasons that YouTube's been so successful is it's quite good at that. And so it's not beyond the wit of man to do something. But I think our version of that should be one which has public service value at its heart.
Thanks.
Jeff. Natasha.
And I've got my own fan that's like to recommend everybody do that.
I'm so jealous.
Talking about YouTube and moving into this space, I mean, it's come up loads of times during the inquiry and here today about the impact of YouTube and the kind of migration of linear audiences onto digital platforms, particularly video streaming platforms. So do we think that the BBC should be allowed to generate some revenue from advertising on YouTube?
Well, at the moment, the BBC is not in a position to generate advertising in the UK. It has struck a partnership with YouTube around creating original content so that we can go where the audience is and learn more about how to do that well. I do think internationally there's an opportunity, and again, it's subject to rights issues, the same things. But if we had BBC-owned content, such as we do in news is quite hard to monetize. As you might understand, advertisers don't necessarily want to be around stories to do with war. If we had our own content, there is an opportunity to do more of that. One of the reasons the BBC is so important, by the way, is that YouTube viewing is typically 85% of viewing is of content made outside the country. So one of the challenges for our culture and what brings us together is if people are on YouTube, they're typically watching 80 or 90% of the content they watch is from outside the UK. What we can offer is a sovereign media platform in the form of iPlayer, which is about content for you, made by you, made where you live, and about your life.
And just kind of go on to that in my next question. I just want to go back to sort of this relationship that the BBC is having with YouTube. How do we ensure that it's not an extractive relationship on YouTube's behalf? Because how do we generate enough income from that to pay for the content that the BBC is making to put on YouTube? Because it's, you talked earlier about pivoting towards, getting less kits and it will bring down the cost of production. But ultimately, how are we going to cover the cost of that, especially if we are subsidising it as taxpayers and licence fee payers?
Yeah, so I think there are two pieces of the question as I understand it there. One is the opportunity to make money by being on YouTube. And to be clear, the only revenue model for us on YouTube at the moment would be advertising or a subscription kind of model, which is not something we do in the UK. What YouTube does offer us is a low-cost way to reach audiences that we're not currently reaching. I would be worried by that if YouTube was small, but also having seen YouTube from the inside, it really doesn't make a huge difference to YouTube whether or not the BBC's content is there. Right? Its growth has been amazing, and it's not been fueled in the main by public service broadcasting. So as long as we feel we're operating on fair terms there, I think we need to invest in reaching audiences there and on other platforms. And a new type of YouTube will come out in a couple of years' time. So we need to engage and understand how to use it on our terms.
What would fair terms look like, I think?
Well, at the moment, the YouTube model is, you upload a video, and if you get more than a certain number of views, you can make money from advertising. You can protect your own copyright on YouTube, and you can choose where the content's shown. So the monetization options are not open to us in the UK, given our remit. And just like, the BBC can be found on Sky, right? So we can be found on Virgin Media. We go on third-party platforms already in the linear world. And if we want to fulfill our universal remit, we need to go on other platforms as well.
That's slightly different because your path back to your native platform, your iPlayer, your owned platform, is far slicker on something like Sky or a connected TV, whereas on YouTube it's very much a walled garden. So again, it's sort of, how do you... I accept that we're going to have to be in these spaces where it's where our viewers are, it's where the eyeballs are, but how do we ensure that it's not an extractive relationship and that we, have that sovereignty and have that sort of...
Absolutely. So we wouldn't sign up to do anything unless we felt like it was in the license fee payers' interest. I think what we can do on YouTube, as it's currently scoped, is on that basis, but we need to kind of keep our eyes open on that, because I think it's so large. Give me some reassurance that by being there, we're not creating additional sort of audience value for YouTube when we're not seeking to monetize. So on monetization, YouTube pays out the majority of revenue from advertising to the content creator and keeps the minority. If we're not advertising, then there's an element of cost to them, not us.
And then there's the government's recent green paper around prominence, something we've talked about on the committee before, and something that I know that public service broadcasters are keen to have. So what do you think are the barriers to prominence on platforms like YouTube?
I welcome the green paper. I think it's well argued and well thought through, both on prominence and on terms of digital switchover and so on. And these are big issues that we need to look into at this point, not later. So on prominence on platforms, it's a great intent. The devil's in the detail. And, imagine if the BBC were told by a third party, you need to, or the government, this is the running order on news at 10, or this is how we need your evening schedule to work. We would rightly sort of push back. Now, this is not a public service funded platform, it's YouTube, but they would argue the algorithm and how we suggest videos is the heart of what we offer. That's the value we deliver. So I think there will be, and we've seen, I think, that there'll be a pushback against that. However, I do think in this polarizing world, number one, YouTube and other platforms have things which we would regard as disinformation. We have to be there. The BBC is like the disinfectant for misinformation if we get our journalism right, and I'm proud of what we do based on what I've seen. So we have to be there, and so we've got to make that balance work in favour of the licence fee payer.
Do you think there's space perhaps for the government to do more with disinformation on platforms like YouTube?
Yeah, so I think there are an array of things that I think could be helpful. Ofcom has invested in expertise in this area, which is useful. For example, looking at the transparency of algorithms on these platforms. So they won't want to open up everything, but like, how do they promote? How much is promoted? What are the ways in which public service media with particular purpose could be deployed? There's obviously then a question for the government about the definition of media that should be or should not be advantage in those platforms. So I think it's important to develop the skills and ideally the insights. And, I noticed that Secretary of State and DCMS has announced that they will no longer be on X, worrying about the way the algorithms have shifted to favour certain types of content. I looked at that and discussed with my colleagues at the BBC. I think we strongly believe that we have to have things like BBC News on those platforms, because otherwise, where is the alternative to some of the misinformation that we see on those platforms? We also have to, though, at some point make judgments about platforms as to whether it is appropriate given the rules of the game in those platforms. So my view is we should always keep under review the third-party platforms where we appear. There'll be new ones we should be on. There'll be maybe others where we decide to pull back.
I suppose the role of the BBC in this space is that ultimately you're a media organisation just as much as X or YouTube is a media organisation, but you're fighting different battles. You'll come under the cosh if someone so much as misquotes a politician, and rightly so, whereas you can have the proliferation of misinformation on third-party platforms. So you're fighting under very different conditions. Perhaps the ultimate thing is pushing for parity, in that they should be treated just as you are and held to the same standard just as you are.
Well, that's a very broad question about media regulation in the UK that I'm not qualified to get into. But I think given our public funding,
you must have a view, given your great
but
role
I think
that you have now.
you're sort of asking, should smaller players, publishers, news publishers, and TV stations be held to the same standard as the BBC? That doesn't seem right to me, given that we are publicly funded.
No, I'm saying I would argue that the BBC and YouTube are pretty big together. Like in terms of size and scale, I think you're probably quite.
YouTube is massively bigger than the BBC.
So you should be held to the same standard then. So if you're being held to a higher standard than YouTube, isn't that not particularly fair?
YouTube is an American-owned, ad-funded platform. The BBC is a publicly funded broadcaster and commissioner of programming. So I do think they're different. I'd like to see high standards being applied to tech platforms, and I think things like social media ban, online safety bill help to push in that direction. I think the more those pieces of regulation are enforced by people who understand the technology and are complemented by codes of practice that move faster than legislation, the better for our citizens.
Could I go back to your point about prominence, and I'd say it slightly differently. I think it's a really, really important question, prominence. I go back to when the EPG became the way we accessed it, and it was an act of Parliament that determined whatever the commercial needs of Sky ran the EPG, that the public service broadcasters, BBC One, BBC Two, were the first 5. That wouldn't have happened, that prominence wouldn't have happened without legislation. I don't think, and I would encourage the government, I welcome their commitment to prominence, that we just don't roll over because of an algorithm. It's important, if you want to preserve public service broadcasting, we absolutely agree that it needs to be on all these different platforms, but we also need to really encourage the government to do what it can to ensure prominence of public service broadcasters on these different platforms. Really important, because they're going to take over the way we consume content, and we cannot let that disappear.
May I just add for 30 seconds on that?
Move us on, because it is boiling in here and I want to get you out of here by 12.
May I just add one thing for 30 seconds, Chair, on that? I didn't mention, because we got into platforms, the other battleground for us is devices. So televisions with connected TVs, and actually in car when you're using your AirPlay or your Android, prominence in those environments is really important too. Otherwise, if you've got these devices in your homes, if the app's not there, you're not considering, just like Samir's example of EPG. Sorry for...
Thank you. I'm going to move. Thank you, Natasha. I'm going to move on to Bayer, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going back to the sort of iPlayer conversation. You've answered some of the questions already, Matt. My next question for you, I suppose, would be sort of what progress have you made following your offer to open up the iPlayer content to other public service broadcasters? And just to sort of bolt onto that, yourself and Dr. Samir sort of mentioned about sort of the archive issue. So I fully appreciate that some of the content is owned, but some of it isn't, and obviously there's the opportunity to still sort of increase scale and reach as well. So if you could look at it like that.
Yeah, so 2 questions there. The second one first, if we had more rights to run content that we commissioned for longer on iPlayer, that would help in offering the audience more. So to the question about buying imports versus content we'd commissioned but we no longer had the rights for, so that's part of what Samir was asking. The first part of your question was about commercial collaboration, I think, or collaboration with others. So I do think there's an opportunity in the long run to have a sovereign streaming platform in the UK. I use that word carefully, but where do you go for quality UK content? And the BBC is the biggest commissioner, but Sky ITV remain an important commissioner, and others can too. And I think that opportunity would be to build on the incredible reach and success of iPlayer. Nobody else has around the world anything like iPlayer's scale and success. The other European broadcasters look at us with envy. So we have had an approach and have had a discussion with Channel 4. In the world of this ITV Sky merger, Channel 4 looks very subscale. All of these mergers are driven by the need to have scale. Channel 4 looks very subscale. One opportunity for them would be, in partnership with the BBC, having content on iPlayer but continuing to be ad-funded. There are an array of commercial, audience, public service and technical issues, but what we'll do is explore that as quickly as we're able, because I think that's something that's going to be important for public service media.
Brilliant. On that point, a quick question for you. I know this probably warrants a much, much longer answer. How can the iPlayer rival YouTube?
Well, it will never be able to rival the scale of YouTube. Funnily enough, if I can tell a short story, I spoke to Mark Thompson in my research about whether I should consider taking the role at the BBC or applying for the role. And he was the Director General when I started at Google back in 2007. And he reminded me we'd had a conversation. He was in the process of launching iPlayer, and YouTube was nascent. And we sort of talked about, I'd forgotten this, we talked about could YouTube be the sort of power behind iPlayer? Could you make YouTube and iPlayer a global public service media platform? It's a shame we didn't do it, because I think that was a great idea, typical of Mark's visionary nature. But I think what you've got now, we've used this word a number of times, is a battle for scale. And the challenge for us in the UK is we're a small country. We punch way above our weight in media and in the creative industries. And we need to kind of make sure we protect that.
Sorry to cut you there. I totally understand that battle for scale, but there's also the heritage and the back catalogue. We're talking a 100-year-old organisation. You look at what Disney does in terms of how it monetises. We were talking about sweating the assets. Totally understand the rights argument, but are we not backing ourselves, or should we back ourselves more?
So I think the issue of rights requires a whole array of different sort of conversations and regulatory sort of challenges. But I would say an opportunity for us in the UK, if you just say strategically what would you do, having the opportunity in one place to have a strong platform internationally and domestically with British content would be amazing. There's a lot of technical and legal barriers to doing that, but I think it's right to have that vision and ambition. I go back to my opening comments, this is a moment of real jeopardy because of the scale and because of the influence of, a handful, as you heard from some of your witnesses, a handful of US and Chinese tech players will dominate the creation and distribution of content in the future. So without that route to scale and without sufficient funding, the little old UK, 60 million people, in a world of 6 billion people, will be underweight. Despite the kind of metrics challenge, reaching 500 million people internationally is a good start. We need to build on that, and world service funding we might come on to, but I think it's a huge opportunity for us in a world where 6 billion people are connected to distribute that brilliant content.
Okay, final question, because I can hear the chair sort of tapping the table, so we're running out of time. So my last question to you is sort of how important is the 2034 date for the switch over from DTT to IPTV for the BBC?
Very conscious of this. I've spoken personally to Ofcom about it and see it in the Green Paper. The most important thing is that we can serve everyone, and so whatever the date of switchover, we need to have a solution for those who have yet to switch. And that's probably a combination of industry and content creators like ourselves coming together. Switching does mean that we can reduce a significant amount of cost that's spent on, basically old infrastructure. And if we can do that, that money can be spent on content, journalism, and technical expertise to serve the public better. But we could only do that in a world where we've solved the remaining households who've yet to switch. And I'm encouraged by some of the things that have been done. And this movie has played out in the past with DTT. So I think we need to get on with that planning now. And I welcome the Green Paper in that respect.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Natasha.
Just very, very quick follow-up on the so I forgot to declare an interest. I used to work at Channel 4 and I used to work in Channel 4 streaming, so I'm very interested in this area.
It's the brilliant questions on YouTube.
Oh, well, thanks. So the idea of because there were many moons ago, there was this thing Seesaw or Kangaroo. There was a massive project to try and make sure that public service broadcasters were ahead of the game, and it's a shame it didn't take off.
I think the regulator put the kibosh on.
Yeah, it was pretty bad decision in my view. But given where we are and your point around scale and the sovereignty and the prominence of our own content and British stories, is the BBC's role, could the BBC role be that kind of flag bearer for bringing the public service broadcasters together under one umbrella to finally establish something that can rival those sort of global players?
Yes, I mean, I hope that we could. It depends a bit on the charter remit and the variety. We're held to account by an array of different, there's the charter, there's the agreements under the charter, there's Ofcom and a whole array of other regulations. But I do think what I would ask is, when we think about regulation in this respect, the world's moving so fast. Kangaroo was killed because people were looking in the rear view mirror, and the pace of change is so fast We should be focusing on the outcomes we want regulation to deliver, not the sort of operations. So I think, if an outcome is how do we get a scale public service media platform in the UK to work, let's work back from that rather than how do we solve this and this and this from where we're starting today. So I think we need to have that vision, and one of the things I hope to bring to the BBC, despite all the challenges, is a sense of vision and optimism about how we can serve the public for decades to come with the right sort of ambition here through Charter, through your support, and through the industry. We've got an incredible industry in this country, punches above its weight, but it's at risk.
Thank you. Joe?
Hi, thanks. So the government included a consultation question, I was really pleased to see, about public purpose to support economic growth. And as someone who was born in Salford, in the very, very place where Media City is now, I see huge economic benefits within the regeneration project that has created, but not so as far as the creative opportunities trickling down to some of our local creative ecosystems. So will your plans to increase BBC activity across the UK include moving more commissioning and decision-making roles outside of M25?
Well, as you know, I've been very keen that we give some muscle to our across the UK strategy, which of course we're all in favour of, and we've done a lot of movement programmes and production, but as I think I've said before, we need to move power out, and that means commissioning. People who own the commission programming have the money and the airtime, and we are making real progress on that. Matt can fill in the detail, but it is absolutely right, just for the BBC to actually deliver its purpose of reflecting the nation. We will do that better if commissioning is also not just concentrated in London, but across the platform. And we've just made 2 or 3 quite serious announcements where we're going to moving commissioning out of London. And I think that's a really important start of what, if we are to realise the BBC's vision of being across the country, power is what we need to do.
2 things. Firstly, the week before last, we announced 2 new commissioning roles outside of London, continuing the trend. On arrival, I asked about this. The thing I was most impressed by, I was pushing to talk about it earlier, was how effective across the UK has been so far. 60% of network spend by the BBC is outside London. 60% already. 55% of staff already are outside London. If we have the scale of funding to continue that, it's absolutely our ambition to continue that. I visited Salford, I did my all-staff call from there on my second day, and I've talked to the local mayor at the time and others about the impact that the BBC's move there has had. I went to Cardiff and I saw BBC Studios producing for S4C, probably Coombe, Casualty, made in Cardiff. It's actually going to be relocated to Cardiff within the show. And I saw 6 or 7 independent productions that were there only because the BBC chose in 2004 to produce Doctor Who in Cardiff. It created the skill set and invested over decades in that skill set such that this money comes in. I just want to make one little pitch, which is today we published something about the economic impact of the BBC, and it suggests that the economy gains 6.7 billion from the BBC being here. For every £1 of licence fee money that we spend, 3.5 times that impact to the economy. And the effects of that across the country, as you've seen, it changes the way the BBC looks and sounds, but it also creates jobs that enable the Netflixes and others to come in and commission content too. So I really support it, want to do more. It'll be hard to do more in an environment of cost cutting because it also costs us to decentralise.
Okay, so and again to Matt, so what extent do you value what the BBC does locally, and for instance through things like local radio?
Yeah, I mean, I visited a number of local radio stations in my sort of mini internship, and it's really clear that they're at the heart of the community. I went to 3 Counties Radio and sat in on the breakfast show, and there's a show they do there which is a consumer show called the JVS show, and as I was there a couple came in with a cake for the presenter who'd helped them to solve a consumer issue. So they're still at the heart of their communities. The audience for radio, local radio, is falling quite significantly, and what the team have done in the last few years is complement it with a digital offer, and we've seen that growth being quite strong, and we're going to need to look again about how we get that mix right. If we move in the right direction with the right funding, I'd like us to do more localised services, but that has a cost to it. It doesn't have to be the same cost as building transmitters and big radio studios, but I think we ought to find a way to go more local if we can.
I'm sort of going back a little bit here as well. So, I mean, just the evaluation, you've given me the stats, you've got a really nice glossy...
There's a nice summary in there, so you don't have to read the whole thing.
Absolutely. But how else are you measuring what you're doing for audience? It's, you know, I know when we're going back to trust and trust issues, people do trust their local news or their local radio. So how are you measuring that in order what you need to do more of?
Yeah, so there's a huge array of data available to us from audiences, and the team look at that all the time in terms of improvement. We look at reach, so how we serve different audience groups. We are underserving younger audiences, underserving working class families, underserving some minority ethnic groups. We need to continue to work hard at that. Being on these other platforms is part of the answer. The creative content is also part of the answer. So being more representative. There was a representation review done before I arrived, which suggested real progress, but more to do. So that's an example. So we look at audience appreciation, we look at reach, and we also look at our economic impact.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask though, Matt, I understand what you say about creating more local output, but it's already quite a delicate ecosystem, local media, print, publishing. A lot of our local newspapers now have a digital offer. To what extent are you aware of that and the kind of inherent responsibility you have not to undermine that really delicate balance?
Really aware. 20 years ago I worked in local press, and I still know people who work in local press. I also, on my second day, visited Birmingham, where our local democracy reporting service is based, and you know they produce work that is published in over 1,000 publications. I think 500,000 articles or something like that since they were created. So that's part of partnering with the ecosystem. But you also have to be cognizant of the facts, and I think I touched on this earlier. But if you take the top 3 local news publishers, when I was working in local press, they had 9,000 journalists. Today, those top 3 have got 3,000 journalists. So we're in a world where, you know, we've already seen a significant reduction of local journalist cover. I'd love us to do more in those areas. There's a couple of ways we can do it. One is the funding to do it. Another is to partner with those organisations and others at greater scale, so local content creators and others. So we need to look at that. To do it, we need to have sufficient funding.
I think that's a really important point, because I know a number of local radio and newspaper journalists who are now your reporters at the BBC, and you know, so it's actually a huge pipeline of talent for you. So you know, looking at how you can.
I mean, so many of our journalists started out in print. It's harder to do that now, but you might start out in a digital local paper. But I am conscious, you know, when I worked there, the internet was already underway, and the shift of advertising from, you know, the homes and property and motors ads that fueled those local press, that was already beginning, and that's why we've seen it fall. So again, the scale of funding to support that local coverage is really important.
Have you had any thoughts on what more you could potentially do to support that?
Look, I'm 6.5 weeks in, and I'm implementing savings. So right now, the chances of us being able to do that under our current funding model are limited. If we were in a position where we had the scale funding, I think there's an array of things that we can do to build on the local democracy reporting service. I'd like us to have more flexibility to partner with other commercial organisations, and I think then I'd sit down with those kinds of publishers. The other thing is, just like in the production arena where you've got some very successful conglomerates, you've also got smaller titles, and we mustn't forget the smaller titles where, you know, some people looking at the democracy reporting service say, well, quite a lot of what it does goes to the bigger players. Well, that's because they've got many more titles. We need to make sure we support the smaller titles, and also there's some brilliant digital startup local coverage services, and there are some lessons to learn there. So I think the BBC should not be crowding them out. We should be looking at how we can complement and work with them.
Lovely, thank you. Vicky?
Matt, one of the things that you said that I thought was really good today was saying about learning from mistakes and building on them and coming back better. One of the other things that I thought was excellent was actually just admitting there is a problem in terms of working class representation. So what more can the BBC or will the BBC be doing to make sure that we actually address that? Because I think this goes then to the heart of problems with trust, in terms of people not wanting to pay their licence fee, and in terms of not connecting with it because it doesn't sound or feel like them at times.
Yeah, so part of the audience metric that you just asked about is understanding how many people feel the BBC is for me, and that's one of the sort of proxies for how we do. I mean, the first part of the answer is creative. So we need to make shows that show you who you are, where you are. So you heard from James Graham, a show about a mining town in Nottingham is something only the BBC would have made. But also, some big shows appeal to those groups as well. So if you look at The Night Manager, which was one of our biggest shows of last year, brilliant show, many people appreciated it, had quite a big C2DE audience. I think of 9 million who watched that show, a third was C2DE. If you think about the return of Gladiators, it was hugely popular, 5 million people watching it. It's made in Sheffield. That kind of show, or Traitors, we're about to have Celebrity Traitors come back again. It's a huge show. So some of the big shows that bring people together, but we also need to make sure that shows that are about people and where they're from. Final example would be Blue Lights in Northern Ireland, won a BAFTA for Best Drama, mainly been viewed in Northern Ireland. It's about the people who are there and the places that they're from, and I think that's part of the unique creative things that BBC can do. So first thing, creative. Second thing, distribution, which we touched on. We need to be where those audiences are.
I think we addressed this last year when we commissioned the Portrayal and Representation Review, and it's really it's a really deep, insightful analysis of why it is that the BBC, how it is the BBC could do better in terms of working class communities. I think there were several observations there. One that really struck me about it was that currently the way we commission, we look at portrayal and diversity in terms of protected characteristics, and class and opinion are not protected characteristics. And I think we need to widen the lens in how we address those sorts of issues when we commission dramas, everything else. The second big idea was it needs to be authentic. There needs to be authenticity around this, and that to deliver that is we go back to the question of moving commissioning out into those areas, but then you get a better, more authentic representation of the people you're talking about.
Thank you very much. And finally, we're going back to Joe.
Last question, you'll be glad to hear. We have spoke about, or you have spoken about mis and disinformation throughout. As you said, it's very present in all our lives. So should the BBC have a new public purpose devoted to countering mis and disinformation?
I think to an extent, the existing remit around impartiality and due impartiality, which require us, is, really, I see that as being about being factually accurate, independent and representative. But it's worth thinking about, and in particular on the technical side. So I think this point about, if the three pillars of what we're offering are audience value, economic value and sovereignty value, we should be looking as part of Charter about how we partner with others to fight misinformation and disinformation. There's a whole bunch of technical investment needed to spot misinformation, so things like digital fingerprinting of synthetic content. There's a lot more we can do there. I want to be clear though, we need to have the funding to do that. And we don't currently have all the technical expertise we need. It's quite hard for any organisation that's not one of the big tech companies to hire the best technical talent. So that's part of what we need. And I think in partnership with government and other UK players like BT and so on, we could do a lot more.
That's interesting. So that collaboration obviously needs more exploration in terms of how you do that. I've spoken
briefly to people like DCIT, BT and GCHQ and others just at the beginning, because I'm conscious this is a question we're all asking. I think the BBC can be part of the answer to that question.
Absolutely. There is something, though, that I do question, because I think one of my colleagues brought it up before as well. It's the public trust that they have in you, which is, as we know, is low. And it's something with the YouGov survey last year, was it 51% from both left or right, doesn't matter where, are not trusting of the BBC and what they say. So when you're trying to say or counter mis and disinformation, is that not difficult?
It's correct to say that trust in the BBC has fallen. Actually, if you look around the world, trust in governments, media, business has fallen everywhere. In the UK, the BBC, although it's fallen, and recent times fallen by further than the trend for reasons you well understand, it's still highly trusted. It's still the most trusted news source in the UK and around the world. We need to work harder to earn that trust. I think you earn the trust every single story you cover, and that's the ethos that we need to have. So, yes, trust levels have fallen. The BBC remains highly trusted despite what's going on, but trust is falling as the media polarises, and that's why we need the BBC.
chicken and egg, isn't it? We need to...
Yes.
Okay. So just last question. How do you respond to the concern that the phrases mis and disinformation are themselves contested and a new purpose would and could create risks for the BBC?
Well, I think, let me go back to the question. I think you're pushing against an open door. I think it's one of the central purposes of the BBC anyway to correct and tackle misinformation, disinformation. That's what people, and that will increase trust. People need to rely upon the BBC to deliver accurate, fair journalism, and also to point out where it is not that. And it sounds a bit circular, but we need the resources and the funding to deliver that purpose. What we need is the resources to do it. As Matt quite rightly said, we need to invest in technology. We probably need partners to be able to do that, but we need the funding to make it happen.
And there is something, I think Demos made a comment with regards to it needs to be strengthened maybe in this place through law. So as well, maybe that is just something to explore and think about.
I think this is the battle around truth and misinformation is on, and it's intensifying, and all of us, government, media, BBC in particular, technology companies need to come together around that, and I think that's part of what I hope we can do under a refreshed charter.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time this morning and for your patience and enduring the conditions, which are not.
It told me it was going to be a hot seat. I didn't realise it was literal.
Yeah, it's been a scorcher. But thank you very much for your time. I don't know if there's any final things.
Can I just make a final observation to the committee? I think you all know this, but in the 100-year history of the BBC, I think we have reached a fork in the road. Right now, we take one path, we'll become a smaller BBC, and we'll be managing decline. And within 10 years' time, we will not be competing. There's another path in which we made the point about some. Just one of your, I think it was Patrick Young said, put yourself 10 years into the future. If the access to content is held by Americans or Chinese, this is a real issue for digital sovereignty. We need to allow the people of this country access to programming about this country through a portal. iPlayer is the best to access it and project yourself in a world where COVID happens again. And we are not there to gather the nation and inform them. And we have people maybe who are very anti-vaxxers. We have people who own things that may be the source of the COVID. This is not a situation we should find ourselves in. So we really are in a fork in the road. And your recommendations, which you will make to the government, I hope what you will do is to encourage the sense that this is a moment of real jeopardy, not just for the BBC, but for the public. We need to have media sovereignty, and we need to have a public service broadcaster of scale and with reliability in terms of funding to get down the right path.
Okay. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you both today.
Thank you.
Order.